It began, as these things so often do, with nothing at all, or rather, with a sound so faint, so entirely mundane that no one else would have noticed it. A sound not of violence or warning, but of something settling, not quite absence, not quite presence, the sound of pages turning. I was walking home from yet another of those college dinners, the kind of affair one endures rather than attends. Prawns curled in regret upon their silver spoons, dons murmuring their epigraphs into claret, and the occasional awkward silence that lingered just a fraction too long. Someone had mentioned, in passing, the death of Dr. Rowthorne. Sad business, but not unexpected. I remember the voice had lingered over the word unexpected, just long enough to make it feel like a lie, or a misquotation. One never knows which is worse. The streets were quiet when I turned onto Holywell. That slant of late autumn rain had begun, the sort that neither falls nor hurries, but merely seeps, and the lamplight pooled uselessly on the cobbles. It's remarkable how Oxford can appear ancient and indifferent in equal measure. You can walk for hours and feel as if no one has looked at you, not even the buildings. Back at my flat, I poured a small measure of Glenfarclas and stood by the bookshelf. Always the same moment of indecision. Poetry or Latin. I chose neither. My fingers touched Pliny the Elder, though I could not say why. I hadn't read it in years. The spine was cold. Rowthorne had been a librarian, retired, kept to himself, a name I'd encountered on the edges of dusty memos and marginalia, the sort of man whose life became footnotes in other people's stories. There had been something about him once, though, hadn't there? A paper on medieval book preservation, with a paragraph so exquisitely bitter it bordered on the romantic. I'd admired him for it, distantly, like one admires a stone bridge. Unnecessary, beautiful, and doomed to erosion. It was the note that brought me back to the idea, not addressed to me, not even meant for me. Left, apparently, on the porter's desk at Trinity. A single sentence in careful capitals. He knew too much. Silence is safer. It had been dismissed as a prank, or so Strange told me over the phone in that practiced tone of administrative weariness. But there was something in it, something unfrivolous. I asked to see the scene. His flat was above a newsagent's on a side street near St. Giles. Narrow, unremarkable, except for its stillness. Death lingers in rooms, you know, not as ghosts, nothing so sentimental, but as a kind of compression. The walls remember. Everything had its place, and each place had its object. A cup inverted in the sink, a framed print of Erasmus, a crossword puzzle folded neatly beside the armchair. It was the puzzle that held me. Rowthorne had completed most of it, as one would expect, but left 6 across blank. The clue, where silence is complete. I didn't write down the answer. I don't think I needed to. The only book not shelved was lying spine down on the floor beside the chair. Pliny the Elder. It could have been a coincidence. Of course it could. But one learns to listen to what rooms are trying not to say. I remember leaning by the window, listening to the hiss of rain on slate and the occasional murmur of late bicycles passing below. The radio was still on, low, classical but indistinct. I didn't turn it off. I felt, for some reason, it would have been impolite. Lewis said later that it was probably natural causes. Heart, perhaps. Age. No sign of forced entry, no blood, no drama. And he was right in the way that facts are often right. But then there's the matter of tone, of how things are said and what is left unsaid. The porter's note, the missing answer, the misaligned book. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat in my dressing gown by the unlit fire, turning pages without reading them, hearing their soft unrest. There are silences that hold no peace. I knew then, without proof, without even the shape of a theory, that something here had not been accidental. Something had folded itself into the pages and been left waiting to be found. And so I returned to the crossword, scribbled its clue onto the margin of a used envelope, and circled it. Where silence is complete. It was a beginning. Of sorts. There is something indecently clean about a sealed flat. The door yields with a hush, not a creak, and the light, when it comes, does so apologetically, as though loath to disturb what it cannot understand. I stepped inside, not because I had to, but because something in me still believed that the dead leave behind sentences unfinished, and I've never been very good at letting them trail off. Dr. Anthony Rowthorne's flat was neither cluttered nor clinical. It existed in that peculiar limbo particular to aging bachelors of the academic breed. Not unkempt, but forgotten. A cup stood upside down on the draining board, like a thought overturned mid-conclusion. A scarf had been draped, not hung, on the coat peg. I noticed that immediately. It's a small difference, the difference between draping and hanging. But it spoke of someone who believed they would return. The man himself had been taken already, of course. Coroner's orders. Lewis had arrived before me and looked faintly apologetic to be there, though not for any reason he could articulate. It was, he said, an unremarkable death. No bruises, no struggle, no mischief with the locks. A doctor's note and a flat bottle of whiskey did the rest. I nodded, but did not speak. There are things one ought not confirm too quickly. A cat lived there, apparently. Or had. No sign of it now, only the polite evidence of a life once shared. A feeding bowl cleaned and shelved. A worn copy of old Possum's Book of Practical Cats beside the bed. I did not touch it. I have never liked Eliot read that way. I wandered. Not aimlessly. Never aimlessly. Though I gave the appearance of someone who had forgotten what he came for. It helps, sometimes. People say more when they think you're uncertain. Rooms, too. There was a framed photograph on the mantelpiece. Not prominently placed, half tucked behind a clock that hadn't been wound in weeks. 4 people in academic robes, squinting into the sun. Rowthorne, unmistakably, is younger and less folded. A woman beside him, her arm lightly touching his. Not possessively, but not indifferent either. I tilted the frame forward. The dust behind it had settled unevenly, as though it had been moved, then returned with too much care. On the desk, a stack of letters was tied with twine. I noted the top envelope had not been opened. No stamp, just a folded card, heavy ivory stock, the kind favored by the old guard of college secretaries. The crest is embossed, not printed. I read the sender's name once, without sound, then returned it to its place. I already knew which college it came from, and I knew that whoever had written it hadn't expected a reply. It was the book that struck me. It lay face down by the armchair, its spine splayed in a way that spoke of unintentional abandonment. Pliny the Elder, the same edition I kept at home, the same chapter marked with a pencil stroke, De Silentio Librorum. On the facing page, a faint circle around the Latin for where even the wind is wordless. I traced the margin with my thumb. Someone had lingered here. Lewis asked me if I thought it meant anything. I said nothing for a moment too long, then murmured that a misplaced book is like a misplaced apology. Either can be corrected, but the damage lingers. He gave me a look I've grown used to, part puzzled, part resigned. He knows I don't always explain things when I should. There was no suicide note, no medication that shouldn't have been there, no sudden signs of haste or violence, and yet the crossword was half done, folded and tucked beneath the arm of the chair, as though set aside only for a moment. I unfolded it carefully, clues inked with the meticulous hand of someone used to answering questions, except one, the same as before. 6 across, where silence is complete. Still blank, but now it felt deliberate. I stayed longer than I needed to. Long enough for the light to begin its slow retreat, brushing across spines and dust and the edge of a life that had made itself small without quite disappearing. When I left, I stood in the hall for a moment, watching the porter through the glass of the outer door. He didn't look up. I suppose it's easy to miss someone standing in silence. But then, I've always thought silence is rarely empty. Sometimes it's the loudest thing in the room. There are corridors in Oxford that refuse to age. Not because they have defeated time, but because they have absorbed it. The wood darkens, the stone smooths under centuries of tread, and still the hush persists. Not reverence, not quite. More a kind of poised indifference. I found myself walking one such passage in Magdalen, past portraits whose eyes had long since forgotten what they were meant to watch. The college had a catalogue of the dead, like all institutions of its sort, bound in black buckram and updated with quiet ceremony by the sub-dean. Dr. Anthony Rowthorne would soon be granted his final appearance there. Neat lines, crisp font, the final parenthesis. But the present, as usual, remained inconveniently unsorted. Lewis had gone ahead to speak with the porter. I let him. He had the knack for small questions that softened people's edges. I preferred to observe. One learns more from a sigh than from an answer. The library was colder than I expected. Not drafty, not uncomfortable. Just cold, in the way cathedrals are cold. Old knowledge doesn't warm its rooms. It merely waits. Dr. Helen Shawcross met me at the entrance, her expression caught somewhere between welcome and suspicion. She wore her academic robes loosely, as though they embarrassed her slightly. I remember her hands, long, fine-fingered, folded one over the other like pages turned against each other. She was, I think, very used to being listened to and very tired of it. She asked me, with a voice honed by footnotes and lectures, whether I had come to officially close the matter or merely poke about in it for sentiment's sake. I replied, too mildly perhaps, that I had come because silence rarely ends of its own accord. She gave me a look, half smile, half elegy. She led me past the catalogue drawers and into a long room filled with glass cases. The new exhibition, Suppressed Voices in Monastic England. It had the smell of fresh wood polish and dust carefully relocated. She gestured toward a central case, its label freshly printed. Rowthorne's last contribution, a facsimile of a letter, unsigned and undated, written in the margin of a psalter. The voice is inked in exile. A fragile phrase, too poetic to be useful. And yet, I asked whether Rowthorne had been enthusiastic about the exhibit. She said no, but not dismissively. She said he'd become quiet about it, almost reverent. He thought there was something missing, she said. He thought one of the voices had been miscatalogued. I looked again at the label. The name attributed to the manuscript, Anonyma of Thornwick Priory, jarred faintly. It wasn't wrong, but it wasn't his voice either. I'd read Rowthorne. He was too precise to permit ambiguity without signaling it. And here there was no signal. In the corner of the room stood a photograph of the team behind the exhibition. 4 faces. Rowthorne, a little stooped, smiling with something close to embarrassment. Shawcross beside him, younger than, eyes not yet tired of nuance. The warden, thin-lipped, grey, preserved in academic vinegar. And a 4th. A man I didn't recognize. Young, tall, his head tilted slightly as if listening to a joke never quite finished. I asked about the 4th. Shawcross looked away for a moment too long, then said he had left academia. Gone abroad, lost contact. The sort of answer Oxford gives when it has decided not to remember someone. There was a letter on the table, addressed to Rowthorne but never posted. Handwritten. Her handwriting. I did not read it, but I noted the date. A week before his death. She said she had meant to speak to him, to explain something, but had thought better of it. Some things, she said, are better left unexplained. She offered tea. I declined. I felt the case closing around itself, not like a trap, but like a book gently shutting. I asked about his state of mind. She said he had been distracted lately, more than usual. He had started correcting things that didn't need correcting. Shelves, dates, spellings. Once, he'd spent a morning insisting that a donor's name was spelt with an E and not an A, despite the official records. She hadn't argued. It hadn't seemed important. But I thought of the name again, Anonyma. It was a placeholder, a mask, not a name but the absence of one. And Rowthorne had known it. I left without asking more. She had told me enough. Not everything, never everything, but enough to shift the light slightly. Outside, the rain had paused, as if waiting for the right moment to begin again. I walked past the chapel, where the organist was rehearsing something faint and dissonant. I paused briefly beneath a stone arch where someone had carved a date that no longer matched any history. And then I remembered the scarf in Rowthorne's flat, how it had been draped, not hung. The gesture of someone who expected a return, not from the world, perhaps, but from someone. There are names in the margins of books that outlive their authors, not bold inscriptions, not the possessive scrawls of ownership, but gentle, fading signatures, the kind made by those who feared they might be forgotten. I have always preferred them, their restraint, their doubt. It was one such name that led me further into Rowthorne's silence. It had begun with a phrase, really. An overheard sentence from the lips of a junior fellow in the Radcliffe camera, half muttered over a tangle of manuscript fragments and digital printouts. She's just a ghost story Rowthorne liked to chase. When pressed, the fellow offered a name, Anselma of Goring. A name I hadn't heard before, though it rang with that particular sort of invented medieval dignity Oxford so often bestows on its myths. Later that day, in the closed collection of All Souls, I found her again. Not in the proper index, of course. She had been footnoted out of credibility decades ago, but tucked between the lines of a long-disputed codex on female monastic writings. A scholar's penciled note. Possible link to Goring, unverified. Suggestive ink patterns in the Lenten passage. I paused over the phrase, suggestive ink patterns. I've seen murders disguised with less subtlety. The room was cold. They always are, those reading rooms, designed to keep history from curling at the edges. A librarian hovered in the background, quiet as the dust. Lewis had grown restless beside me, fingering the corner of a visitor's ledger with the unease of someone who never quite believes books can bite. I turned another page and found her, or rather, found the echo of her. A marginal commentary in cramped Latin, translated with hesitant strokes in the footnotes. I kept my words folded in cloth, stitched into the hem. There was no attribution, no date, only a quiet speculation in the notes. Maybe Anselma's own hand, but disputed. I made no remark, only underlined the phrase in my mind. There was something about the phrasing, not the content, but the cadence. Folded in cloth. I had seen that construction before, somewhere, not recently. I let it hover. Later that afternoon, I returned to Rowthorne's flat. No warrant, no ceremony, simply the trust that years of reluctant courtesy sometimes accrue. The light was dimmer now, the afternoon having turned in on itself with rain. The cat, or evidence thereof, remained absent. I opened his desk drawer. Not rummaging, just allowing the drawer to breathe. Inside, among receipts and ink cartridges, was a postcard. Sepia-toned, depicting a ruined priory and a misted hill beyond. On the reverse, a single line. I dreamt of her again. She was wearing the psalter. No signature. There are dreams that masquerade as scholarship. I have known men who spent decades annotating footnotes, not because they believed the truth lay there, but because they had once seen someone beautiful turn the page beside them. A hunch, nothing more, took me to the old archives in Keble, a place even the librarians considered haunted. Not by ghosts, of course, just too much paper. I found what I had not known I was looking for, an old departmental inventory from the 1960s. Rowthorne's name, Signed twice, once on a manuscript requisition form and again beneath a minor disciplinary note. Reprimanded for removing materials from special collections without authorization. Item returned, no damage. And beside the line in the margin, a faint smudge. A small penciled loop, no context, just a mark. But it was identical, absolutely identical, to one I had seen earlier that day in the Goring folio. A scholar's unconscious habit, perhaps, or something else. A fingerprint of obsession. Lewis asked me, over late coffee, whether I thought the woman, and Selma, or whoever she had once been, was real. I said I wasn't sure, but I believed Rowthorne thought she was, and that belief in certain men is more dangerous than proof. Before bed, I revisited Rowthorne's final crossword. One clue I had missed before. 13 across. Hidden, yet heard. I pondered it longer than I care to admit. The answer, eventually, whisper. And with that, I knew we were no longer dealing with the past. Not entirely. It had been scheduled. That much was certain. A small square on the Hillary term program, 3rd week, Tuesday evening, 7:15 sharp. The title had been precise in its ambiguity. Silence and the Sacred. Anonymity in medieval confession. Typical Rowthorne. Just enough solemnity to ensure sparse attendance, just enough promise of revelation to compel the curious. But the lecture never happened. The porter at the main lodge remembered unlocking the hall. Lights on, heating turned. A lectern is prepared. But no Rowthorne. The audience had waited 16 minutes, then drifted out in ones and twos, murmuring with the untroubled air of people glad to have fulfilled an obligation by simply turning up. That was all. No drama. No note. Just absence. I found myself at the bottom of the panelled staircase in Merton's old reading wing, where Rowthorne's lectures were often recorded out of courtesy rather than posterity. The AV technician, a postgrad with mournful hair and a cardigan buttoned unevenly, admitted they had kept a few files from the previous term, said he rather liked Rowthorne's voice. Calm, clipped, full of suspicion. I didn't correct him. He handed over a flash drive with a slight, ironic flourish. It held only one file. Rowthorne Lecture Winter Session. The timestamp suggested it had been recorded precisely 1 year before his death. A sort of echo then, a voice returning through time, just once more. That evening I poured a measure of Lafourche and listened. The flat, unlit but for the amber cast from my desk lamp, took on the weight of a confession. Rowthorne's voice began with Latin, a passage from De Institutione Clericorum, delivered without translation, a deliberate narrowing of his audience, I thought. Then, a pivot. He spoke of the idea of the silenced witness in monastic texts, not those forced into silence, but those who chose it, or who, more subtly, erased themselves by writing only in the margins. The scribe as self-effacer, and then came the misquotation. I'd heard the poem before. John dons a nocturnal upon Saint Lucy's day. But Rowthorne rendered the line differently. Not, I am the very dead of winter, as Donne wrote it, but I am the library of silence. A phrase that doesn't exist in the poem at all. At first, I assumed it was a mistake, a slippage. But Rowthorne was not the sort to err in recitation. He used that phrase again, later in the talk, this time with deliberate weight, as though inviting the listener to pause. A private code, perhaps. I played it back 3 times, and on the 3rd, I noticed something else. A slight hesitation, the smallest fracture in his rhythm, when he reached a particular name, Anselma. Not Anselma of Goring, as she appears in the official records, but simply Anselma. No attribution, no context, the way one speaks a name privately, without expecting recognition, as though she belonged only to him. Lewis phoned, interrupting my thoughts with the awkward timing he's never quite perfected. Said he'd found something in the Bodleian's event records, annotations in Rowthorne's own hand. The lecture that wasn't given had a title in pencil beneath the official print, The Psalter of Absence. I didn't tell Lewis what that meant. Not yet. After I hung up, I sat in silence. Not the silence of sleep or fatigue, but that heavy, pre-dawn kind that sits too still. The kind that reminds you of something is missing, though you cannot say what. I retrieved a book I hadn't opened in years, a slim, privately printed collection of essays from the late 70s in which Rowthorne had contributed a brief piece on marginalia. A forgettable thing, but there, in the closing paragraph, he wrote this: "Some names exist only in the breath between two words. They cannot be archived, only remembered." I do not believe in ghosts, not in the traditional sense, but there are echoes that linger, not because they refuse to leave, but because we have failed to answer them. That night I dreamt of a library beneath the earth, where each book had no title and every page began in the middle of a sentence. Her name was Elspeth Minter, though few called her that now. She had long since been folded into the quiet bureaucracy of the past, filed under those subheadings Oxford rarely speaks aloud. Not promoted, never married, too sharp. She had once been the archivist of St. Cuthbert's, that odd minor college tucked behind Merton, mostly known for its crumbling sundial and an unusually severe portrait of Milton that glared above the SCR fireplace like a disappointed headmaster. I had telephoned first, of course. She answered on the third ring with a voice that carried the crisp authority of someone who'd spent decades correcting mislabeled documents and half-remembered quotations. I said I was inquiring about Dr. Anthony Rowthorne. There was a silence, brief but considered. Then she said she had just made tea, and if I didn't mind real leaves and a sliver of silence, I could come at 3:30. Her rooms were at the top of a townhouse overlooking the Botanic Garden, the sort of place where nothing had changed since the Thatcher era, and even then, only grudgingly. Books lined every wall, not arranged alphabetically or by theme, but by tone. I recognized the system at once. She said little at first, only gestured toward the chair opposite hers and poured Darjeeling into mismatched porcelain. She did not offer milk. I did not ask. When I said Rowthorne's name again, she sighed. Not theatrically, more like a drawer being opened reluctantly. She said he had been brilliant once, but a difficult kind of brilliant. The sort that drew sharp lines around itself, as if to mark territory. He had come to St. Cuthbert's for a term in 72, working on what was then called the Confessional Codex. Said he'd found something that couldn't be footnoted. She smiled at the memory, though not kindly. A man too fond of being misunderstood, she said, often ends up misunderstood on purpose. I asked what he thought he'd found. She paused, her hands still on the rim of her cup. A passage, she said, in a lesser-known psalter. Not marginalia. Not quite. A set of instructions, perhaps. Notes from an anchoress to her successor. They weren't supposed to be there. That was the point. He became obsessed, she said. Claimed the voice belonged to a woman deliberately erased from the record. Said the college archives had covered it up in the 19th century, back when such things were quietly corrected. She admitted she hadn't believed him. Still didn't, not entirely. Then she said it. There had been a folio, a single leaf of vellum with the disputed text. She had seen it, just once, and then it vanished. She didn't accuse him. That would have been too coarse. But her silence, the way it settled into the corners of the room, did it for her. I asked what happened after. A pause. Her voice is quieter now. A student died. Margaret Eade, history postgraduate, one of Rowthorne's advisees. Bright but solitary, the sort who carries a fountain pen and wears gloves long after winter. She fell from Magdalen Bridge one evening. No note, no witnesses. She said the college ruled it a suicide, but then added, almost carelessly, that the folio vanished the same week. There are moments in investigation, rare ones, when the air changes, as if some current beneath the floorboards has shifted, and suddenly the cold comes from within. I asked if she'd ever spoken to Rowthorne after that. A single nod. Once, many years later, in a Bodleian corridor. He had grown paler, she said. Not older, just paler, like something had been leached from him. He had looked at her and said quite simply, "I should have said no," then walked on. Lewis was waiting for me outside in the drizzle, notebook in hand, coat too short at the cuffs. He asked what she'd said. I told him enough to keep him quiet, but not enough to weigh him down. He wouldn't have cared about Anselma or anchorites or voices in the margins. But I did, not for academic reasons, for personal ones. We walked past the Bodleian, where the windows held their glow like watchful eyes. I found myself thinking about that phrase from Rowthorne's lecture again. The library of silence. Not a metaphor, I realized now. A location, a warning, a place where something had been hidden once, or buried. At home, I unfolded Rowthorne's crossword again. I hadn't intended to, but the habit had formed. 14 down, to vanish without sound. 7 letters. I wrote them in slowly. Eclipse. And then I stared at the letters above and below it. They didn't spell anything. Yet, I've always mistrusted things that vanish too neatly. A set of vanished pages, a vanished name, a vanished woman. They suggest a tidy hand behind the untidiness of life. And Oxford, for all its reverence for disarray, is a place that cultivates erasure with unusual elegance. The note arrived without occasion. No envelope, no stamp. Just a folded slip of cream paper wedged between 2 volumes on my desk. The origin of the index and a forgettable monograph on Salter bindings. The script was clean. Block capitals, unhurried. You're not the first to ask about the folio. Below, a torn scrap of ledger paper, browned at the edges. A single line entry, 13th February, 1963. MS BOD CUTH 179 MED. The handwriting of the registrar, barely legible but unmistakable in its flourish on the capital E, Margaret Edie. I knew the name, of course. A quiet suicide half a century ago, dismissed in an inch of college minutes and a quarter column in the Oxford Mail. No inquest worth remembering, no relatives who stayed long enough to raise the right questions. Her thesis is unfinished, her fellowship posthumous in everything but name. The ledger note felt like a whisper from a locked room. Lewis, predictably, asked how it had arrived. I told him I didn't know. He asked again. I gave him a look. That was enough. We took the entry to the Special Collections office at the Bodleian, a place with more ghosts than readers. The woman behind the desk wore an expression that had outlived 3 principles. She frowned when I showed her the code, said it referred to a manuscript that no longer existed in their system, withdrawn decades ago, no record of where or why. But she admitted, in a voice that sounded more like exhalation than speech, that some items had been re-archived. Her word. Not deleted, not misplaced. Just shifted into silence. I asked to see the 1963 access logs. She disappeared without explanation for 21 minutes, returning with a wheeled cart stacked with buff folders, each labeled in a brittle, faded hand. She said I could look, but not for long. Everything had to be returned before 6. She didn't specify what would happen at 6, and I didn't ask. Inside the 3rd folder, I found it. A familiar page, a list of readers for February of that year, and there it was again. M.E.D., the only woman listed that week, the only person listed for that document in the entire year. In the margin, a penciled question mark beside her name. No explanation. Just the mark. It was the same pencil stroke I had seen in the Goring Salter notes, the same faint loop Rowthorne made in his lecture manuscripts. The same pressure, the same doubt, There are few things more intimate than a question mark written by hand. Back at the office, I laid out everything we had. The catalogue entry, the photograph of the research team, the library card from Rowthorne's flat, and the postcard, the one with the ruined priory and the line on the back. I dreamt of her again. She was wearing the psalter. That line had stayed with me long after it should have faded. Lewis hovered. He had that look he gets when he wants to say something, obvious but knows better. Eventually, he asked whether I believed the manuscript ever existed at all. I told him belief wasn't required. Only pattern, and that the pattern was beginning to show. That night, I walked alone through Radcliffe Square, where the rain made mirrors of every step and the Bodleian's dome rose like a hollow crown. I stopped beneath the arch of the school's quad and listened, not for sound, but for what it failed to contain. There's a silence here that knows the weight of too many truths never filed, the kind that drips slowly, like a leak in the stone. Back at home, I turned again to Rowthorne's crossword. I had promised myself I wouldn't, not that night. But promises made in solitude have little spine. 17 across, the shadow in a forgotten ledger. 8 letters. I paused. Then, lightly, I wrote it in. Footnote. I've always believed that the worst lies are the ones wrapped in affection, the gentle omissions, the rearranged memories, the lines people don't cross because the person on the other side once looked at them softly in lamplight. Academic circles are thick with those kinds of lies. Like ivy, they cling not just to stone but to names, reputations, shared glances in seminar rooms, essays co-authored under the illusion of equality. There is always something left unsaid. I found Dr. Helen Shawcross in the cloister garden, a place so carefully kept that it seemed no one ever truly entered it. She was walking alone with a notebook pressed shut against her chest. Not reading, not writing, just carrying it like one carries old grief. Her coat, though pressed, had a thread loose near the collar. It was that sort of detail I noticed more lately. She said I was early. I said she was late. The truth, as usual, sat somewhere in the middle, and neither of us pursued it. She offered me a seat on the worn stone bench beneath the holly tree. I declined, choosing instead to lean against the balustrade. Proximity without trust. I asked her about Margaret Ede. There was no tremor in her voice when she answered, only a pause long enough to fold something inward. She said Margaret had been brilliant, unusually so, and solitary, in the way women in scholarship often are, not because they prefer it, but because solitude is easier to control than affection. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. I asked whether Rowthorne had loved her. She said he had admired her, which in Oxford is often more dangerous. Then she said something peculiar, that Margaret had once written a paper she never submitted, a short, speculative piece on the ethics of textual erasure in medieval female confession. Helen had read it. She said it was too angry, too beautiful, and too likely to be misunderstood. She told Margaret to revise it. Margaret never did. She mentioned almost carelessly that the last time she saw Margaret, the girl had been carrying a folded letter, addressed, she thought, to Rowthorne. No, one never found it. I asked her if she had feelings for Rowthorne herself. She laughed quietly. Not the kind of laugh meant to charm, but the kind meant to delay. She said he had once asked her to annotate a set of lecture notes for him. She'd agreed. In pencil. Later, she found he had inked over the lines and published them as his own. She called it an old academic joke. I didn't laugh. She stood then, brushing an invisible fleck from her skirt, and asked if I thought Rowthorne's death was really so mysterious. I said I wasn't sure. Those mysteries weren't always about murder. Sometimes they were about silence, about why people choose not to say certain things, or choose the wrong moment to tell the truth. She didn't argue. Later, I walked alone through the hallway outside the old catalogue room. The glass cabinets lining the corridor held commemorative volumes, inscribed spines, portraits that had been darkened not by soot but by forgetfulness. I paused at a photograph, a group taken in the 60s. St. Cuthbert's Research Group. Margaret Eade, unmistakably younger than the others, stood in the corner, slightly turned away. Rowthorne beside her, and at the very edge, half cut from the frame, Helen. Her eyes were not on the camera, but on Margaret. There is a language and posture I've always preferred to speech. Back in my office, I opened the crossword again. This time it wasn't the clues that caught me. It was the order of completion. Rowthorne had filled the grid with a peculiar pattern, not left to right, not top to bottom, but diagonally, as though led by something other than logic. And the answers weren't just words, they were phrases. Footnote, whisper, eclipse, absence. Not clues, sentences, or apologies. One entry, still unfinished. 15 down, the silence after confession. 9 letters. I considered it for a long time. Then, with unusual certainty, I wrote, after word. There are things one does not see until the pattern insists. You stare and stare again, and the image remains inert. Until suddenly, with a shift in angle or light or silence, it reveals itself not as coincidence, but as design. That is how it was with Rowthorne's crossword. I had returned home from another of those conversations that leave you with more silences than answers. Lewis had spoken earnestly about timelines and access logs. Someone else had mentioned motive, as if that were a thing one could find tucked behind a cupboard door. But none of it mattered until the clues stopped being clues. I unfolded the puzzle for what must have been the 12th time. I had long since copied it out by hand, twice, for neatness and proximity. But it was the original I trusted, the one that still smelled faintly of pipe smoke and the acidic varnish of a dead man's furniture. The grid was tight, symmetrical, too precise. I had known Rowthorne's mind, from lectures, from paper margins, from footnotes and glances. He had been the kind of man who found elegance more important than revelation. His crosswords had always reflected that, a fondness for double meanings, for mythic references flattened into puns. But this was different. 4 answers stood out now, not for their cleverness, but for their strangeness in context. Whisper, absence, footnote, afterword. And beneath them, half concealed in crossings I dismissed as filler, came others. Goring, seal, crypt. It wasn't a crossword, not anymore. It was a letter, a confession disguised as structure. I spread the puzzle on my desk and mapped it, not by words, but by order of completion. The strokes of ink told their own tale. Rowthorne had filled the grid diagonally, left to right, top to bottom. A slope of sorts, descending. There was one clue that remained blank, 6 across, where silence is complete. I had thought, weeks ago, the answer was crypt, but now, with the others in place, it no longer fits. I read the clue again. The wording was too crafted. It wasn't silence in the acoustic sense. It was silence as enclosure, as decision. Then I noticed it. The vertical intersecting word, the down entry, was Margaret. Not directly, not as a clue, but by the first letters of the words Rowthorne had used to fill that column. Margaret. I said her name aloud, and then I said nothing at all. I went back to the photograph Helen had shown me, the one taken at the beginning of the Goring-Salter project, the one with Rowthorne, Helen, the warden, and the unnamed young man who had apparently left for America or gone into publishing, the kind of professions Oxford assigns to its ghosts. I had looked at the others. Now I looked at Margaret. She was not smiling. That was common. Photographs from that era were suspicious of joy. But her gaze was fixed, not on the camera, but on Rowthorne. Not in longing, nor disappointment. Something else. An unsettled knowing, the kind you only wear when something inside you has moved on but left its shadow behind. And then I saw it. Her hand, partly visible in the frame, was holding something. A book. Small, cloth-bound, no title. A notebook. Or perhaps a diary. Not quite visible, not quite hidden. I'd missed it before. Lewis was at the station, poring over old files in the half-hearted way that suggests hope is waning. I told him nothing about the crossword. Not yet. He wouldn't have seen it the same way. Would have asked for motive, for fingerprints, for a medical examiner's report with a timestamp accurate to the second. But there are times when the soul's timekeeping has no relation to the clock. I returned home just as the streetlights began their slow glow. I poured a single measure of scotch and turned the puzzle one last time. If the pattern held, there would be something at the center. A single square, unconnected, silent. It was the center square of the whole grid. Empty, no letter required, no clue given, deliberately so. A void. And it was there, that I understood. Not the crime, not the cause, but the shape of the grief. Rowthorne had loved her, perhaps wrongly, perhaps belatedly, but fully, and whatever happened on that bridge in '63 had never left him. He had stitched her name into his final puzzle, not to confess guilt, but to preserve memory. Some men leave behind books, others buildings. Rowthorne left a grid of silence. It was never the prominent shelves that mattered, not the ones displayed at eye level, where leather-bound volumes loitered like polite guests waiting to be noticed. The truths, the real ones, lived lower. In the dust-shadowed alcoves, behind classification cards long untouched, where fingers no longer lingered. St. Cuthbert's archive had been undergoing a quiet reordering, as the warden called it. A euphemism, I thought, for forgetting with intent. A new digital system had made half the collection redundant and the other half inconvenient. The dusty, the delicate, the ones that came without provenance. They were to be relocated. It was this decision, this desire for neatness, that gave me my chance. I had asked to see the obsolete cataloging practices shelf. The phrase had caught my ear in a staff memo Lewis had passed over without thought. But I remembered hearing Rowthorne use it once, years ago, during a conversation about Goring. His tone then had been dry, almost amused. Where they bury what doesn't fit. A thin graduate assistant. One of those temporary presences who shuffle like shadows through colleges, too clever for corridors and too tired for conversation. Let me in with the worn brass key. She didn't ask why. I suspect she'd learned not to. The room was cold, not by design, but by absence. The sort of cold that comes when something has been left waiting too long. The shelf itself was unremarkable. Midway down the east wall, between withdrawn maps of clerical boundaries and an incomplete register of stone rubbings from defunct priory chapels. I bent, not hurriedly, and ran my finger along the spines. Thin pamphlets, mislabeled notebooks, and one collection of hymnal marginalia in what looked like a child's hand. Then, almost lodged too tightly to remove, a folio. Canvas-bound, unnumbered, unloved. Inside, 41 pages, the final one blank. No formal title, but a slip of aged paper tucked within, bearing Rowthorne's cramped hand. To remain unread is to remain safe. The manuscript itself was stranger than I had imagined. Not confessional, not even especially theological. Instead, it was a kind of guided reflection. Notations for someone retreating into silence, instructions for the safeguarding of memory without writing. You must think the sentence until it disappears, one line at a time. You must listen until the sound resembles your own name. I do not know if Anselma of Goring wrote it, but someone did, and someone else decided it should not be seen. On the reverse of the 30th page, faint and unindexed, was a name. Not in ink, not in pencil, but in the indentation of a pen that was never pressed hard enough to commit. M. Aid. I closed the folio. Some truths do not need to be exposed. They only need to be understood. Outside, the rain had begun again. tapping the leaded windows with the gentleness of a memory unsure of its welcome. I returned the folio exactly where I'd found it. I did not sign the visitor's log. The assistant was gone, or perhaps had never been there. These buildings make myths about people quickly. I walked through the quad slowly, past students whose worries had not yet calcified, past windows where curtain edges glowed amber and laughter leaked through the stone. The warden was waiting by the porter's lodge. He said he had heard I'd been in the archive. His tone was light, too light. He said he remembered Rowthorne well, a man of unusual loyalty, if not always of sound judgment. Said he was sorry the old fellow had gone so quietly. I asked whether he had known Margaret Ede. He blinked once, then said the name wasn't familiar, but something in the tightening of his jaw told me it was. He said some records had been lost during renovations in the 70s. Said things often were, back then. I said nothing. We both knew the phrase lost in renovation had its own shelf in Oxford, a full one. That night I returned home and found the puzzle still open on my desk. I had not written anything since afterward, but a new clue had formed, not in the grid, but in the margin, where I had absent-mindedly drawn the spine of the folio I'd held, and beside it, a word I hadn't meant to write. Kept, there's a particular kind of silence that belongs only to libraries at closing. Not the quiet of restraint nor of reverence, but a silence that feels earned. It is the hush after a confession, or perhaps after something has been almost remembered. That was the silence that followed me through the stacks that evening, long after I had any business being there. Lewis had gone home. He'd mumbled something about shepherd's pie and a night off, which I didn't quite believe, but I let him go. He had done his part, compiled lists, timed statements, retrieved printouts from clerical dustbins. But what I needed now wasn't paper, it was proximity. I wandered the perimeter of the lower gallery in St. Cuthbert's, letting my fingers trail just above the bindings, not touching, just reading the air. My footsteps echoed faintly, padded by the velvet unease that accompanies the feeling that you are not quite alone, even when you are, or especially then. The rain had eased. The lamps flickered more than they should have. One bulb had gone entirely in the north alcove, leaving the entire section, ecclesiastical correspondences, if memory served, in a sort of semi-exile. I stood in that half-light and waited. I thought of Rowthorne, of Margaret, of Anselma, names that never quite belonged in the same sentence, but had ended there anyway. I thought of Helen, her voice so carefully composed that it had forgotten what it sounded like unarranged. I thought of the crossword, still unfinished, though only barely now. And I thought of the bursar. It had been a moment, a minor one, hours earlier, that had first made the idea form. He had been giving a tour of the new archival annex to some donors. I'd watched from a distance, sipping something tepid and vaguely wine-like, when he gestured to a display case and said the words, "We even recovered the Goring manuscript." Thought lost for years. He said it too casually. No pause, no flicker of surprise at the rediscovery, as though it had never been lost to him at all. Later, I had asked him about Rowthorne. He'd offered that practiced academic sympathy, a soft sigh, a regretful tone, the faint narrowing of the eyes to simulate memory. But when I mentioned Margaret Ede, something broke, not visibly, but in the rhythm of his answers. He began speaking faster, then slower. He said he barely remembered her, but used her full name, always a mistake. I hadn't pushed then. I didn't need to. The crossword had already begun to suggest the rest. That was the moment I returned to now, standing in the stacks, waiting for nothing in particular. Eventually, I moved again, toward the exhibition room. The Goring folio had been quietly installed that morning. No announcement, just a new placard, discreet and self-congratulatory. Recovered manuscript, thought lost since the 1960s, donated anonymously. I stood before the glass and read it twice. It was not the original. That much I knew. The folio I'd held in the catalogue room had a crease on the inside cover, faint but unmistakable, like the ghost of a folded letter once tucked inside. This one did not, but it was enough to satisfy the donors, and perhaps the bursar's conscience. I leaned closer and saw the tiniest fragment of white beneath the display's velvet matting. Not enough to read, just enough to know that something had been hidden badly, or too hastily. A page removed and replaced, or just misplaced truth? I left the library without signing out. Outside, the night had turned to mist. Not quite fog, not quite rain. That in-between weather Oxford wears like a secret. At home, I poured the last of the bottle and sat before the crossword one final time. I stared at the grid. The words now made sense only as memory. Absence, afterword, whisper, kept. There was one last clue. 10 across. A name that ends but does not fade. 8 letters. I didn't write it at once. I let the pencil hover. Eventually I wrote Margaret. Not as an answer, but as a recognition. Then I folded the puzzle, placed it between the pages of a book I hadn't opened in years, Latin hymns of the anchorites, and left it there. Some things do not need to be solved, only remembered.